Good evening, everyone. I'm Charlie Kyle, the principal of Innis College, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this year's Innis Alumni Lecture. So before we begin, I will read the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and to celebrate on this land. I typically say a little something after the land acknowledgement, in part to communicate that it is not just a rote recitation of words that everyone's already familiar with, but also to have us take a moment to think about what those words mean. And I think in conjunction with tonight's lecture, I would say that one of the things we need to kind of reflect on is the degree to which there is a string of indebtedness that runs across centuries and generations, and that we should learn from what has come out of what has come before us, and no better person than to communicate that to us than an historian. So I am going to not, in true U of T fashion, I'm not going to introduce our speaker, but rather I'm going to introduce the person who will be the moderator for our speaker, who will then in turn introduce the speaker. But there is a logic to that because our moderator and our speaker have a shared past that I'm sure will be alluded to when the introduction comes. I will simply say about our speaker, Jeremy Adelman, that this is a delight long coming, because Jeremy was originally scheduled to be the Innis Alumni speaker in March of 2020. And if you have, yes, the right memory, you will say, oh, well, I know what happened there. So Jeremy was not able to come at that time. He has been part of an Innis event since, but I've always wanted him to come back to give this, not this lecture, I'm sure it was going to be a different lecture back in 2020, but nonetheless, to come and give the Innis Alumni Lecture. So I'm absolutely just beside myself with joy that he is here tonight to give us this lecture. But I'm now going to introduce our person who will be the interlocutor with Jeremy once his talk has taken place, and will also be taking questions from you, the audience, when that phase of the event happens. So let me introduce Cindy Ewing. Cindy Ewing is Assistant Professor of Contemporary International History at the University of Toronto. She also teaches in the International Relations program at Trinity College. Her research focuses on the histories of rights, decolonization, and the Cold War in South and Southeast Asia. Her work has appeared in the American Historical Review, Journal of Global History, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and Cold War History, among others. And Cindy and I share shared appointments in the Department of History, so I'm happy to have a colleague here tonight. So please welcome Cindy Ewing.
Thank you, Charlie. It is such an honor to introduce our distinguished guest tonight. Let me start with the German-born historian Albert Hirschman. After escaping the onslaught of fascism, then participated in anti-fascist underground activism by joining the International Brigades during the Spanish Civil War. He brought this worldview to Latin America, spending multiple decades doing development work, where he generated some of his most important and influential intellectual ideas. In 1971, his essay, A Bias for Hope, Hirschman theorized possibilism as a way to reject the rigid dogma and determinism of fellow Cold Warrior economists, instead encouraging us to embrace local knowledge, learning through uncertainty, and creative problem solving to bring uplift around the world. Now, from this work, Hirschman formulated a number of ideas, some of which you might be familiar, including the hiding hand and exit voice and loyalty, which enabled peoples across the global south a new agency against corporatism and dictatorship. Now, in the 20th century, perhaps no other economist has done more to expand scholarly thinking across borders against settled convention toward a more global perspective than the worldly philosopher Albert Hirschman. In kind, there is no historian living today in our current age of crisis who has done more to expand our understanding of the past towards the same global, capacious, and even humane horizon than Hirschman's biographer, Professor Jeremy Adelman. Jeremy is the Henry Charles Lee Professor Emeritus of History at Princeton University and the director of the Global History Lab at the University of Cambridge. Now, I can't mention them all here. Jeremy is the author and editor of over a dozen books, including Frontier Development, Land, Labor, and Capital on the Wheatlands of Argentina and Canada, Republic of Capital, Buenos Aires and the Legal Transformation of the Atlantic World, and Sovereignty and Revolution in the Iberian Atlantic, for which I experienced very intensive questioning during my PhD comprehensive exams. His most recent books include Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, A History of Humankind from the Beginning to the Present, the groundbreaking biography that I've mentioned, Worldly Philosopher, The Odyssey of Albert O. Hirschman, along with 5 edited volumes and 2 forthcoming books. He is also the winner of several prestigious awards, including the Guggenheim, the Joseph Spengler Prize, the American Historical Association James A. Raleigh Prize, and the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. Now, to give you just one small indication of Jeremy's accomplishments as a teacher, Jeremy's Global History Lab has enrolled over 200 students since beginning in 2012, partnering with institutions in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Europe to extend learning opportunities to refugees and to fractured communities. Jeremy has been a trailblazer in my own field of global history. And though I did not work with Jeremy when I was a graduate student, I have benefited from and drawn inspiration from his towering scholarly influence, civic courage, and mentorship across continents. On a world scale, so many of us are Jeremy's students. And lastly, Jeremy is well known to this community as one of its most distinguished alumni. It is my pleasure to welcome, as this year's Innis Alumni Lecturer, Professor Jeremy Adelman.
So, of course, thank you, Cindy, although the dilemma now is the bar is so high. It's ridiculous. I'm going to let you all down. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Charlie, for the invitation. It seems like the place to see an age when we were talking about me coming down to talk to do this event before COVID hit. And indeed, the project that I had originally imagined has completely changed as a result. So the first thing I need to do is to figure out how I change slides. There we go. Okay. So just bear with me here. To press forward is...
I think you just do that.
Just do this? There we go. Okay, and to reverse? Okay, I'll not go in reverse.
It takes 2
then.
PhDs, no, maybe 3 to figure out how
I'll
to
just
reverse.
make sure. Okay,
So-
no reverse, so I'll make sure I don't make a mistake.
Lots of time to read the first.
Okay, there we go. Yes, that's right. So I'll come to this graph in a minute. It's a great pleasure to be here back kind of home. I was an undergraduate at Innis a long time ago. And Innis will come up a few times in the course of the lecture. But as I thought about coming back home to my college, I thought about things that I had read when I was here. And I just, as kind of a word of acknowledgement to Peter Russell, who was a principal before you, Charlie, and Dennis, who was the principal when I was here as a student. I don't know if these names mean anything to anybody out there, but it was Peter who put me on to Harold Innis at the very beginning, and reading Innis, and I don't know if this is still possible for principals to do, but putting on a special reading course that somebody walked me through the entire oeuvre of Innis, for which I got credit. I don't know if anybody's read Innis lately. He's a tough read. So I needed to do it for course credit. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would have done it. Anyway, a lot of the thinking about the relationship between empire, communications, and media you're going to see as one of the important through lines to the lecture. And they're ideas that I've been thinking about and been thinking about for 40 years and surfacing over the last 10 years in the course of writing this book, which is coming out in July. So let me start with a problem. And this is the first first side of the problem, which is it's a story of global GDP growth since 1800. On a per capita basis, global GDP grew in that span, some 2 centuries, by a factor of 10. So the improvement of global world welfare is undeniable, what's happened in the last 200 years. And as it reached its peak up at the top there, let me juxtapose this with another image, and this is the problem we have. The more bounty we got, the more reaction we got. And this is a photograph taken by a wonderful Greek photojournalist, and here you're going to see the media and technologies play an important role in this story about what happened to globalization. By Yanis Barakis, a fantastic photojournalist and that recently passed away from cancer. For Reuters, is in this particular case a photograph taken in 2016 of Syrian migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean to Europe and the reaction in Europe against the migrant flow and the rising barriers to entry on the part of destitute people. So we have 2 images. We have an image of incredible growth of prosperity, dynamism, and you're going to see very closely correlated to the openness of flows, and yet a reaction, a combination of prosperity and images of incredible desperation. So how do we reconcile the bonanza that comes from opening the world with the reaction and efforts now to close it down? Hence the COVID inflection point. So in a way, what I've written is a history of this mystery, a deep history of what Mark Carney called the rupture, and how much that speech that he gave at Davos really changed global discourse, in a sense only reinforced the need to explain how we got here. So let's do, as Julie Andrews asked us to do, let's start at the beginning. All right? So what I'm going to do is talk first about the outlines of the general argument and give us some tools, analytical tools to use to explain the paradox of incredible plenty and destitution and reaction at the same time. Some navigation tools. First begins with the concept that Charlie alluded to of interdependence itself, which I define as the growing need for strangers across borders for each other. Strangers need each other, and the accent is the needs for strangers, not the needs of strangers, which is the traditional vocabulary of the cosmopolitan imaginary. You're going to see why dependency is very important and why Harold Innis gets us going thinking about this. So it's a growing need among strangers for each other, for food, fuel, work, security, and the element that is probably the least appreciated, which is recognition. So the argument today, I'll give you 2 tools to work with, and then we'll go into a couple of stories, is about the paradox of interdependence. That interdependence magnifies the rewards from relying on each other's labor and creativity. It yields increasing returns, which you saw on that graph, right? And yet, it intensifies risk. Because interdependence means each side who makes the bargain with the other side cedes to the other, let's call them strangers, a measure of control over the distribution of those returns. So dependency means giving up sovereignty. And that is a source of anxiety and fear. So you get love and prosperity, anxiety and fear coiled together in the same dynamic. There is a tension And there has been a tension at the core of the making of the modern world. It has been often wrenching, especially as the perceptions of risk and vulnerability from depending on strangers and strangers depending on us rises. Interdependence has been at the source of the basic arguments that have defined the modern era. So what does it mean to depend on strangers for wealth, recognition, and survival? What does it mean to have strangers depend on us? These questions have animated the norms, policies, and commitments from 19th century empires to the World Trade Organization to the return of our fractious, ruptured world of today. So how to understand that paradox of reward and risk when they are coiled together in the very same phenomena? Well, there are two features to help us think about this process. One is that interdependence has always yielded mixed feelings, hence the love and the fear. There is an emotional dimension to this story, and if you read Harold Innis, you will miss the emotions entirely, so you can't get the guidance from there. But the excitement, the expanding frontiers, the opportunity, along with the anxiety and the suspicion are all gathered together, and on times unspool, the anxiety and suspicion in particular, into dehumanization and extermination. More on that shortly. Some strangers lay claim to what other strangers have, including their land, their bodies, and their existence. This emotional experience, a kind of roller coaster of the world, has a history that begins, in fact, with the prophets of capitalism at the beginning. So let's travel back in time, as the historian takes you back to Adam Smith, and to a book that people don't spend that much time reading because they focus on the Wealth of Nations for good reason. It's an astonishing work. But this one is the theory of moral sentiments. And Adam Smith asks his readers in the theory of moral sentiments to engage in a kind of thought experiment. And the thought experiment is to imagine an English gentleman drinking tea, and as he is this gentleman of the world, quote unquote, is drinking his tea, he reads the news. The media is always there. He's reading the news about an earthquake in China, and tens of thousands of people in China have perished because of the earthquake. And Adam Smith asks his readers to engage in this thought experiment. Would this gentleman, as he's drinking Chinese tea, be as concerned for the suffering of the Chinese peasants who produced the tea as he did for the pain in his little finger? Will the pain in your little finger overwhelm the ability to sympathize with the pain of Chinese tea producers, even if you depend on them for that tea? So at stake for Smith was whether our sympathies for strangers could keep pace with our self-interest in them. If not, what would restrain our needs for the strangers to produce the tea that we need from motivating predatory or cruel behavior? And I think we're all witness to how this is playing out in the news today. But this was on Adam Smith's mind. How would sympathy keep pace with our self-interest? So the capacity to connect sympathy with self-interest, which is what agonized him, would determine how strangers would treat other strangers whom they needed. Now, there was a dilemma here in the schema that Adam Smith is trying to resolve, which is that in that passage, Smith worried that the ability to align sympathy with self-interest depended, above all, on the management of distance. In the old days, in marketplaces where strangers would come together and exchange their wares, silk in return for spices and so on and so forth, in these routine exchanges of the medieval world, strangers were always in contact with it. They would see each other in the marketplace. That the ability to see, and that's the core of Adam Smith's thought experiment. Could the gentleman see? If he could just see the suffering, he would be able to close the gap between sympathy and self-interest. That the ability to see strangers, our neighbor strangers, would soften our manage, what he called douceur. It would bring softness to how we engage with each other. So the ability to see strangers was a determinant of one's, in a sense, affective registry. The problem was, the dilemma was, that the expansion of commercial society broke those local visible bonds between strangers. The distance made strangers invisible to each other. It was impossible to see the Chinese peasant who produced the tea that you drank. Enter the mediation of the gentleman of humanity reading the news in Smith's thought experiments, because by the 1840s, and this is why Harold Innis does help us as thinking about media, as free trade, the campaigns to abolish slavery, steam engines, underwater cables began to suture the world together to create an interdependent world. There was a media revolution that made strangers intervisible to each other as they became increasingly interdependent with each other. That you could literally see the strangers that you depended on, thanks to this media revolution. So the second feature of the model that we're going to build before we get into our stories is how strangers saw and imaged each other as determinants for their sentiments about their interdependence on each other. How did the management of distance contour this story? Well, Smith's thought experiment, if the gentleman of humanity could just see, of course, by the time free trade came along, that is precisely what happened. With mass migration, international investment from the 1840s, people could see. Reporters, ethnographers, photographers, and here the photograph taken by a Venetian photographer, Felice Beato, shot from the Second Opium War, and which would later be displayed at the Henry Herring Gallery on Regent Street and provoked a furious debate about the legitimacy of the Opium War in China, and the role of British troops, and the morality of opening China while slaughtering its soldiers who were defending Chinese sovereignty, that these images came home to represent strangers. Beato was one of increasing numbers of photographers who would fan out into the world to produce the images of intervisibility. There were merchants, there were investors, there were economists, all producing, through communication, representations of strangers in our lives. And it wasn't just these professionals. There were amateurs as well, producing an image of strangers far away. In this particular case, a photograph taken by my grandfather. I promised my brother that I would put him up on the screen. This is 1936, hold that year. It's our grandfather in China, taking photographs of the very Chinese peasants that he would send back to the Ottawa Valley to raise funds for the China Mission, as it was called then. The whole point of taking photographs of the people that you were trying to convert was to generate funds to sustain the mission. So here were these slideshows that were being produced to connect rural China with rural Ontario. This thickness and the everydayness of this flow and exchange of photographs, images of all kinds in communication, I'm just going to, as it were, focus on the photographs for this lecture, was very important to the story. Again, hold 36 in your mind. We'll come back to it. The point being that viewing and imaging or imagining strangers then conditioned the emotions that governed the relations between them. And ever since, there's been a great debate, of course. The optimists of the world at the time, from the middle of the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass, thought that photographs would create the sympathies that would generate a humanitarian revolution. In fact, he firmly believed that photographs of enslaved bodies was crucial for promoting the abolitionist cause, that photographing atrocities in faraway places was crucial for generating sympathy for the victims of atrocities. This has been a very strong strain in the humanitarian tradition from the middle of the 19th century to our day. The assumption, of course, was seeing the sufferer would generate sympathy for them. And there were, of course, pessimists at the same time. Frederick Douglass himself is a realist about the problem or the danger of the overproduction of the images of suffering. And by the 1970s, Guy Debord, Susan Sontag, and others would grow increasingly concerned that we would be, as it were, suffering from a humanitarian fatigue, overwhelmed by the scale and reproduced, recycled, commodified images of other people suffering far away. So there's been a debate about just how effective the images would be to the story. So these are the elements of our navigation tools. Right? Number one, that we acknowledge the internal or endogenous tensions of interdependence. It's not just a one-way street. That we have mixed emotions from the very same experience. And finally, attention to the factors that activate sentiments, especially the role of the media and the senses. Well, what do they mean for the big story? Now we have our guidance system. We're going to use these. So if you can hold the model, there's an internal tension. It's mediated by the role of communications, and emotions are pulled by interdependence in 180-degree oppositional directions. The core of the argument of the project here is that we don't really debate, when we talk about interdependence, about whether we should be interdependent between strangers, but rather how to be interdependent between strangers. That the model that we feud over is not over between isolation or independence versus interdependence. It's what model of interdependence will rule the world. Will it be inclusive or horizontal, or exclusive and extractive? Or, to be more historically accurate, what mixture of extractive and inclusion will we really get? Why this is important is because I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding about Donald Trump, just the elephant in the room. He is not, though he uses the rhetoric of independence, he's not in fact talking about independence. He's talking about interdependence on one side's terms. We should be very clear about that, and I think that is what Mark Carney was making the case for at Davos. But to understand this, we need one more heuristic tool. So I'm going to put this up, and we're going to use this a couple of times in the course of the lecture. It's ideal types, on one hand. What kind of interdependence will rule the world? And let's just stylize two alternatives. One is the altruistic one, in which one side internalizes all the losses of interdependence, all the risks, all the hazards. I internalize and I externalize the gains to the other side. At the other end of the spectrum is, there's a fight over what word I should use. Is it really nativist? I had originally put up tribalist, but people thought that was objectionable. So let's call them the nativist position, which wants to internalize all the gains and externalize all the costs, all the hazards, all the risks. And what the combination will obtain is really at the core of modern world history. That's been largely the fight that we've been engaged in. What nativists want is interdependence on their terms, which means externalizing the costs and internalizing the gains. Now, let's get on with the story. So we have we have some tools, we have a model that we're going to explore, and I want to talk about two transitions and help us perhaps think about the transition that we're in the middle of now. Let's go back to Harold Innis and start as economic historians. My economic history DNA will come out here. And just to say that, so for those of you, there's maybe a challenge, this is the flows of openness and closeness of migration, capital, and trade openness across the world from the real age of expansion, 1880, to roughly 2000. And you can see the clear cycles there. A few takeaways from this chart. First of all, trade accompanies and is driven by, in fact, other forms of openness. It's not just the exchange of commodities, it's the flows of people and the flows of capital. We need a complex understanding of openness and closure. And another one is that when trade slows, so do the other variables. You cannot separate capital and human migrant flows from commodity flows. Trade, ever since 2008, I'm going to come to that at the very end of the lecture, has been bumping at around 50 to 60% of global GDP. There are a couple of broad phases here that's very clear. There's the phase from the late let's say the late 19th century up to 1920. It's the first phase of opening, the uncoupling of production and consumption, often associated with free trade and migration and foreign investment. Anybody who studied Canadian economic history will be very familiar with this. So that wheat from Canada that Harold Innis wrote about would feed the urbanites in Liverpool in return for ironware. Then, of course, comes the long crisis, 1914 to 1945, and then the arduous reconstruction until the 1973. And one thing to hold in your minds is what happens from the 1970s onwards. I'm going to come back to that in our second transition. So that first phase of opening is associated with exchange between primary producers and between producers and consumers. The second phase is associated with the internationalization of the production process itself, and in fact, the expansion of what we would eventually come to call value chains into the global south with the industrialization of Asia and in particular China. This is where we see the role of Chinese share of global manufacturing or for exported goods as a share of GDP soar from the mid-1970s onwards as supply chains expanded out towards Asia. Finally, into a third phase. If the first phase was the unbundling of consumers and producers, and the second phase was unbundling the production process itself into value or supply chains, the third phase is what some economists call globotics, applied to the service industry, really, in a sense, combining the supply chains and services with the application of robotics and intelligence, which is, of course, why higher education is so crucial for how we manage this transition to the new form of interdependence. So we're in the middle of this transition now. How to think about transitions. And we're going to look at two of them, one from the 1930s and one from the 1970s, with very different outcomes. And we'll want to know why and help us think perhaps how we might think about the current transition. Let's start with the 1930s. I'll be very brief because a lot of it should be familiar to you, I hope. With the crisis of 1929 and the increasing vexing with the breakdown of the international interdependent order, not just the trading system, led to the Great Depression of the 1930s, which is, of course, when Harold Innis really began. His doctoral dissertation was on the Canadian Pacific Railway. It was published, I think, in the mid-1920s. But it's in 1930 when he publishes his first major book that made an impact in Canadian economic history, which is the fur trade in Canada. And it's already by then that he's worried about dependency, a view from the margins, that peripheral countries live in a precarious place in the wider world order, defined by their interdependence. By the late 1930s, Cindy's already kind of given this away, Albert Hirschman is also worried about the ways in which Hitler's foreign economic policy is increasingly predatory around Europe. And he will write, and it would be published in 1945, a trailblazing book that's now come back. It's kind of an urtext in what's called geoeconomics. It's called the structure, national power and the structure of foreign trade. So there's a lot of vexing in the 1930s about the changing nature and the dangers of predatory interdependence. Latin Americans were worried about this as well. Some very systematic thinking about what would be called eventually dependency theory. This is an image taken in 1933 of the signing of what was called the Roca-Runciman Pact, which gave to British exporters of manufacturing extra special concessions to get access to the Argentine market so that Argentine beef exporters could have access to the British market, which is, of course, a concession that the Argentines had to get on their knees for, which was a response to the Ottawa imperial preferences of just the year earlier. In a sense, already great powers were feuding over and using these kinds of what Donald Trump would call deals to extract benefits from weaker trade partners. And in fact, this treaty was so onerous, it became kind of the flag to represent how Britain was exploiting Argentina that would become the symbol that the Peronists would use on their way to power in 1946. So the 1930s was a period of predatory commercial relations, unfair trade treaties, bilateralism replacing multilateralism. Sound familiar? Because it should be. What's now called geoeconomics. And it would eventually turn into outright land grabbing in Manchuria, China, Poland. So let's put the 30s into the wider spectrum and come back to our graph. It's a case in which a flawed effort to rebuild the international system after 1918 finally broke down in the 1930s, and the pendulum swings from a balance of altruism and nativism far over to the right-hand side of the screen. And the rewards to nativism, externalizing the costs and internalizing the gains, took force. This, of course, was fueled by doomsday prophecies, Malthusian specters of running out of resources, too much population, scrambling for strategic resources. In those days, it was magnesium and tungsten and other materials, and the creation of security blocks, and the weaponization of world trade. Most of all, above all, in food. And there was an enormous anxiety about food security, shortages, mass hunger, memories, in fact, of the First World War and the trade blocks that the Allies had used against Germany. And if you read Mein Kampf, tough go, you'll see just how much Hitler was obsessed with food security. Or what some might call food sovereignty. Mein Kampf tirades about how liberal free traders had allowed Germany to become dependent on open commerce with foreigners and strangers when you could just grab their land and keep it for yourself. Never again should the nation depend on strangers that they could not control, dominate, or exterminate. That's the through line of Mein Kampf. Now remember how trade correlates with other variables of openness, which includes immigration. This was also a period of rising immigration restrictions. From 1924, the U.S. National Origins Act. Canada would distinguish itself from being very extreme in its controls over migrants after 1931, notorious particularly for Chinese and Jewish migrants. And where race and resources would get tangled together, you can see in the case of a man like Isaiah Bowman, who was the president of the American Geographical Society, president of Johns Hopkins University, a very close aide to the Roosevelt administration, and a virulent anti-Semite, who would make the case for the need for survival of civilizations to have access to what he called the pioneer fringe of one's own, or what Hitler would call the room to grow. So 1929 was an economic catalyst, rising economic insecurities, fears of population running out, hunger, shortages, and a nativist scramble into outright grabbing, starting with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which was an important source of magnesium, which was crucial for aircraft construction, tungsten to harden alloys to make machine tools and ammunition, and above all, coal. And here, a poster extolling the virtues of the unity of Japan, China, and Manchuria under Japanese leadership, which, of course, and this is why I alerted you, and this is another photograph, this time of Chinese nationalist troops out to defend against invading Japanese forces in Shandong, where my grandfather was. So 1936-37. Strong, big countries driving hard bargains against weaker neighbors to form rivalrous blocs. And if you read George Orwell's 1984, this was the world economy that he had thought would become the natural order of things, even if there was a peace after 1945, of a world divided into blocks of Oceania or Eurasia and East Asia, not unlike a lot of the bloc theorizing that's going on now in the negotiations between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. This is Wikipedia's rendering of Orwell's 1934 superpowers. The gray, incidentally, is what Orwell called the disputed areas that always loom in the novel in the backdrop as where the real carnage is happening in the fight over resources and recognition. What is important about the grabbing of the 1930s is that none of these grabbers were isolationists. They may have used the terminology of America first, but first denotes that there's a second, a third, and a last. That they wanted a hierarchy to replace the more horizontal internationalism, although I can suspect Cindy's going to push back on just how idealized this might have been, but the horizontal inclusive internationalism of world treaties, the rule of law, that restrained predatory behavior. So the debate in the 1930s was not whether to be independent or interdependent, but it was who controlled the terms of interdependence. And this control depended in large measure on how interdependence was imagined and imaged. Bring back the image story. And remember the neuralgic moment, as I told you to, 1936, that affected the representation of strangers to each other. So okay, I can't go back. That photograph taken from my grandfather's Leica for Canadian parishioners to witness. There were many others who were looking at photographs of what was happening in China after the Japanese invasion, first of Manchuria and then the mainland. One of the viewers of photographs like those was a man called Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was watching very closely what was happening in Japanese expansion. He was also watching very closely what was happening in 35-36 in Ethiopia. As stories were emerging in the press, in this case it's the New York Times, about the enslavement and humanitarian abuses that were happening in Ethiopia in the mid-1930s. And Mussolini was nursing dreams of avenging the humiliation of Italian troops from the 1890s and yearning for his own room to grow, his own bloc, and used the humanitarian crisis generated around enslavement in Ethiopia to justify an intervention, which became an expansion in the 1930s, in 1935-36. Mussolini would invade Ethiopia, involved in bombing British and Swedish Red Cross field stations, especially in the Coram Plain, to become what one journalist, a man called George Steer, would call terror bombing from the skies. And in fact, if you go to the Red Cross archives in Geneva, there's a debate among the Red Cross about whether putting the Red Cross on the, you could see, I don't have on the right-hand photograph, whether there's a debate whether to sew a Red Cross onto the top of the tents was actually turning the tent into a target for the bombers, assuming that it would have the opposite effect. One of the witnesses, and we're looking at images and witnessing of the bombing campaign and was keeping photographs of these shells, was George Steer, the correspondent for the London Times, who would write back and send his dispatches back to London on the terror bombing, and received a cable in late 1936 ordering him to go to Spain. And while he did that, while he was sailing to Spain, he was putting the finishing touches to a book about Mussolini himself called Caesar in Abyssinia. The preface is finally finished in Burgos, and it would be printed in December of that year. So he's in Bilbao at the time, and this is April 26, 1937. Journalists were gathering for dinner at the Torrontegi Hotel in Bilbao, and a man comes tearing into the hotel. A nearby town was on fire. So Steer jumps into a car with Christopher Holmes of Reuters, Noel Monks from the Daily Express, and Mathieu Cormand from Ce Soir. And they drove through the night to this town, and as they neared it, they could see the sky beginning to glow from the burning. When they arrived, Steer called it a royal carpet of live coals. The town's name was Guernica. Operation Rugen, this is from the Petit Journal, would recycle some of Steer's translated reportage, was an episode of hours of terror bombing, as Steer had witnessed in Ethiopia. 4 days later, Steer's chronicle was translated and published in Le Petit Journal and reprinted elsewhere. One of his readers and viewers of the photographs that went with the story was a man called Pablo Picasso, who had been commissioned but was stuck. He'd been commissioned by the Republican government to paint something for the pavilion of the World's Fair. It couldn't muster an idea of what he would do, but when he saw the reportage in the paper, in Le Petit Journal, and other papers, on May 1st, he went into a 36-day frenzy, chronicled by his lover, Dora Maar, who was herself an incredible experimental photographer, Picasso himself was always obsessed with photography. And he painted, or created rather, Guernica in black and white, like the images that he saw in the papers he was reading. It was meant to be easier to reproduce in print. He used matte house paint to reduce the glare. He pressed charcoal, like the charred houses that he saw in the photograph, into the work. Newsprint itself gets pushed into the canvas. And if you look closely at the final, so this is Dora Maar's photograph. Here's the final product. We can't be sure, but he may have included Le Petit Journal and L'Humanité, pieces that he'd been reading about what happened in Guernica, into the work itself. Note the final version features the backdrop to the figurative violence. There is newsprint itself. The most famous artwork to represent the agonies of strangers in world history was also a portrait of a world seized by nativist and predators. What about George Steer? Well, he would be appalled by the Times' policy of reportage on both sides. He would resign from the Times, enlist in the British Army, and die in a jeep accident in Burma. So that's a story of one transition. A crisis of interdependence that spirals into horror, fueled by fear, zero-sum anxiety, loathing, and dehumanization of strangers for having what other strangers wanted and needed. So let's look at another transition that did not turn out that way, because the fear does not have to turn into loathing. It's the 1970s. It was a lot like the 1930s. There were lots of fears of decline and alarmism, apocalyptic prophecies. The Club of Rome in 1972 predicted the end of prosperity as we knew it, all the curves pointing in all the wrong directions, all at the same time. And anxieties about the planet. In this particular case, 1972 coincides with Club of Rome report. The representation of the orb itself from Apollo that gave terrestrials a very disturbing image of the planet. Very contrary to that other famous photograph of what's called Earthrise from 1968. Here was a more precarious, lonely, fragile planet, all alone. There's no foreground, there's no background. And the anxiety that this image produced, in fact, this is the original. It was off-center, the planet is upside down, the color is disturbing. By the time people really started, when you go out and go onto the internet, you'll see a very different version. The planet is pivoted back the way it should be to assuage people's anxieties. This was not the only, so images from Apollo was one source of anxiety. Satellite images began to emerge. And by 1973, the War Department, began to share the results of the images that were coming from satellites from the air of what was happening on the planet with the Commerce Department, and later the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, just in time to begin to chronicle the effects of what was called the Asian brown cloud. So all around were increasing anxieties in the 70s and 80s about the end of an era of inescapable togetherness, but shortages, running out of space, pollution, and a Malthusian calamity. It would also be fueled by increasing spectacles of want and need among strangers. The photograph, this taken by the great Brazilian photographer Sebastião Salgado of the Sahel, spectacles of drought and the neediness of strangers to be rescued. And in fact, the photography in creating the images of suffering became part of the photojournalistic industry by the late 1970s. In fact, getting the shot was the story itself. I'll give you an example of that. In 1979, Rosalind Carter goes to the Thai side of the border to look at refugee camps for Cambodian refugees. And here's an episode, it's an infamous episode in which Rosalind Carter, as Jimmy Carter is about to run in the 1980 election, on human rights, foreign policy, she's dispatched to the refugee camps. And it's extremely important. And one reason why I like this particular photograph is you can see the photographer. Usually they get airbrushed out of the picture to create the illusion of photographic objectivity. But no, they're always there shooting. And her aides are pushing the UNHCR staff around and the refugees trying to get the right money shot, particularly of a sick baby, until they can finally find one. They're shrieking at the camp director, a man called Mark Malloch Brown, whom I interviewed for this, until they could find the right baby. Put it into Rosalind Carter's arms, get the money shot, and move on. This, of course, is the backdrop to why Susan Sontag and so many other people were concerned by the late 1970s of empathetic fatigue, that people were being manipulated and their, as it were, Adam Smith's sympathies were being abused. So, the 1970s, great concern about running out, humanitarian calamities, and of course, to top things off, an economic shock to the system. Remember, a lot of the legislation that Donald Trump has used to justify his tariffs came out of the 1970s response to the malaise. And of course, a world historical war in 1973 that led to the oil shock after October. So, economic, visual, planetary, everything is going wrong in the 1970s, not unlike the 1930s, and intensified the urge to hoard and externalize the brain. Tariffs, capital controls, immigration restrictions, nationalism, hello Petrocan, all created as a response to trying to manage interdependence. But it didn't go the way of the 1930s. Why not? Well, two forces behind the scenes really changed the calculus. Both of them improbable because they had been seen to be the source of the problem, in fact, were the solution, or at least the way out. And they supercharged, rather than a retreat to predatory interdependence, what we call now globalization. Deep, deep interdependence. And the two ingredients here were carbon and credit. While everybody was predicting in the 1970s the end of oil and the end of carbon dependency, in fact, we were just getting started. To give you an index of the soaring degree of interdependence on fossil fuels, look no further than CO2 emissions. A lot of this, of course, and that's why if you go back to the lecture where we talked about the industrialization of Asia and the expansion of value chains, a lot of the rise in fossil fuel addiction is associated with that. So, the expansion of new fuel frontiers in Canada, the North Sea, and above all, Siberia. As Europe pivoted from dependence on Gulf oil to dependence on Russian oil. With the obvious effects, of course, one of the externalities would be carbon emissions, which would culminate in the spectacle of what we're now seeing of the de-icing of the world. So, increasing dependence on carbon was one way out. In fact, increasing dependence on strangers for fuel in this particular case. Another was what was happening on capital markets. And I won't go into a lot of details on this unless we can get into it in the Q&A, but the deregulation of capital markets, the creation of offshore banking accounts, it's often called the butler economy, begins to take off. And in fact, carbon and credit are coiled together because it was the influx of capital into the holdings of oil exporting countries that could not absorb this capital that got recycled into the offshore bank accounts, particularly in the euro-dollar markets, led to the spread of loans to the rest of the world. To give you an index of how that worked, you can see the growth of international banking from the mid-1970s to 2008. You can see how the bubble gets pricked thin in 2008. So it was this combination of cheap oil and cheap credit that, in a sense, literally fueled globalization from the 1970s. Rather than a reversal of interdependence or a turn to predatory interdependence, was globalization until 2008 and the financial crisis. But 2008 alone, and this I'll end on this note, was not enough to prick the end of deep interdependence. While it did took the halo off Homo Deus, in fact, the reliance on carbon and credit increased after 2008, did not decrease. So we need a different story of entanglement and globality. And for that, we need to turn to the Middle East, the site of the merging crisis of a climate crisis with a debt crisis together, and a geopolitical crisis. Three converging forces: an image revolution in social media, drought that would spread as a result of climate change, and CO2 emissions that would create a crisis of the agrarian systems of the Middle East, and a state collapse after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. By 2008, while we were worried about the debt crisis, in fact, UN observers in Syria were warning of what they called social destruction. With rising pressure on debtor nations, increasingly began to crack, especially in Egypt, Syria, and other places. So that in 2010, when drought hit Russia and Ukraine, food prices began to soar. This is how interdependent the system had become. That governments in the Middle East that were already groaning from high levels of debt were forced to reduce their subsidies on food prices, especially flour, and cut back. Until in December 2010, a Tunisian fruit vendor called Mohamed Bouazizi set himself aflame and set off the cascade called the Arab Spring. States were under enormous pressure to pay their creditors. One by one began to collapse, until in March 2011, students and protesters rose up against the dictator of Syria called Bashar al-Assad. So, who benefits from interdependence will depend here in the push. That was what was at stake in that year. In this particular case, this is a photograph taken at the Aleppo Media Center in 2013, when I mentioned that there was a media revolution happening with the rise of social media. Twitter had come on, Facebook had come on, that photographers had, backed by French and British journalists based out of Beirut, began to train photographers to catalog the civil war in Syria, to put out images on these new platforms to sway global public opinion, particularly in Washington under President Obama, to side with the rebels against the Assad regime. Of course, we know now that is not what happened. But the war was taking place on the ground in Aleppo, and for the first time in world history, social platforms of social media. And then, of course, came September 2015, and the image by the Turkish photojournalist of Nilüfer Demir, of Alan Kurdi. I don't have to tell Canadians about the effect of that photograph, but in Europe and elsewhere, it was seismic. So while there was a groundswell of sympathy for the needs of strangers and the precarity of this system of interdependence that had been built up since the 1970s, there was also a backlash, a surge in alt narratives, panic, fear, anxieties about what became called the Great Replacement, that the image war could cut both ways, and indeed the images could be the war itself. The very same images of destitution where we started out in the lecture could also be weaponized, in this particular case, by Nigel Farage, who's now leading in the polls in Great Britain, in a campaign to pull Britain out of Europe. Another example of the images being weaponized is the construction of the images to produce the anxiety itself. In this case, Lukashenko, who had been bringing refugees to the Belarusian-Polish border and pushing the refugees into Poland, forcing the Polish border guards to drive back the refugees in front of photojournalists to represent how the West was not living up to its humanitarian rhetoric, and to destabilize internal European migratory balancing up. Let's end on a slightly more upbeat. Back to Yanis Barakis, the Greek photojournalist, who's walking along the beach in one of the islands in the Mediterranean and photographs a Palestinian woman looking out at the sea. Where does this leave us now? Not just torn, but polarized. We face a paradox, that the more integration yields more bounty and more risk at the same time, more togetherness and more detachment. By now, not just any risk, of course, but the risk that strangers one doesn't know and never will can have effects on your life and your death. That we need to recognize this to challenge the simplicities of being pro-globalization and its euphoria, or the doomsayers nowadays. What's the lesson for today? Well, I have three kind of tentative arguments. First, we need to shift the debate about interdependence versus independence. That is simply the wrong way of posing the crisis. The crisis is what kind, the question is what kind of interdependence do we want and need? What mixture of horizontality and verticality, of inclusion, exclusion, can we bear as humans? Donald Trump is not anti-global, not at all. But for the very same reason, the nostalgia for the liberal rule and norm-based order was not as inclusive as it liked to think it was. The liberal order wasn't as benevolent to those who didn't design it. You can ask the Argentine and Syrian civilians whose despots borrowed money and then left civilians with the bill. To ask what kind of interdependence we need starts with a recognition that we have mixed feelings about what it means to depend on strangers and have them depend on us. Needing each other. It's not because people are bad or good, one or the other. It's because needing each other is a source of risk and vulnerability. Interdependence can be the source of prosperity, of wonder, and agony at the very same time. Second, what do we do about our institutions, the treaties, the assembly of parts that had been built up ever since Nagasaki? Well, I worry slightly, a lot actually, that we're in a bind, a slow downward spiral. That our international institutions are not up to the tasks for managing the interdependence that we do need, but they're effective enough to prevent shocks from turning into great systemic crises. 2008, COVID, and so on. And in fact, the nativists don't really want to tear down international institutions. Those are great institutions for handling the externalization of the costs of interdependence. Keep them on a lifeline. Manage the crisis to externalize the costs while you hoard the gains, which of course leaves the institutions exhausted, lacking legitimacy and resources, yet vital to prevent a true calamity. And this spiral only increases the perception of risk, reward, and tilts the pendulum ever further to the right of our model to motivate hoarding grabbing, and dehumanizing strangers. Third point, and it's almost a contradiction, I'm sorry, but doomsday thinking does not help at all. The lesson from the earlier transitions is don't confuse transitions with end times. Just because this is a rough patch doesn't mean things are over. When transitions are seen as end times, as they were in the 1930s, these can become self-fulfilling calamities. All endings also are stories about beginnings and openness. That's why the reading of the 1970s as a transition towards deepening interdependence is important to remember. In fact, the doomists of the 1970s missed the signs of the transformations that were in fact unfolding in the 1970s because they were so convinced of their doomsday scenarios. Gloomy certainties sound great, but they obstruct open thinking, surprises, and alternatives. Coping and rethinking nowadays is going to require human capabilities, imaginings of alternatives, and joint ideas about interdependence when they are all in short supply and doomsday thinking gets in the way of that. But at the same time, we have to confront our internally divided, ambivalent selves, the mixed up, conflicted sentiments or sympathies and self-interests that dependency produces. We have to admit our ambivalence. And I think if we can do that, we can start to become better listeners, good students, if there are any students out there, good witnesses. And a place to start is to recover the threads of a global history of interdependence, about thinking and imagining togetherness in a different way. Some of those arguments that have been lost or forgotten, but which we are going to dearly need to meet the years ahead. Thank you very much. There's some scheming. Okay. There, this one's on.
This is on too. I'm all set. I'm all set. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for that amazing broad sweep of history. I think we all received 12 weeks of term in 1 hour, so congratulations. I'm going to take the prerogative of asking a first question while the audience takes a minute to gather their thoughts and come up with their own questions as well. Now, I buy that Trump is not anti-global, and I buy that nativists are not opposed to interdependence. But I wonder if we've ever had an international order that is not to the right of the spectrum, that is not nativist interdependency. The two periods of transition you offered us, the 1930s, the 1970s, the 1930s was followed by the end of the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations, the domination of the international order by the US in setting the rules-based international order that we've all come to love and miss. The 1970s, followed by the implosion of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the New World Order proclaimed by Bush Sr. In both of those transition periods, to me, it seems we're actually arriving at a point further to the right of nativist interdependence. So is there a combination of altruism and nativism that you see in this history of 2.5 centuries? Or are you calling on us to think about that possibility? Because I'm sort of thinking of the narrative you gave us, and to me, I'm seeing the rise of the Mussolinis, the rise of the figures who utilize interdependency towards their own nationalist aims.
Yeah, that's. I mean, those are the graph it's a heuristic. They're ideal types at either end. We never have pure right side or left side, and the issue is where the pendulum is going to swing around in the middle. And so the question is, was the post-45 order, let's say that Harold Innis and Albert Hirschman had in mind when they thought we need a multilateral, let's say, international system to restrain predators to prevent a repeat of what led to the calamities of the 1930s and 1940s. And what you got was a compromise, right? You had an American empire, Pax Americana. We can go into the details of what happened. I mean, Cindy's the actual expert in the room on this. But I would say it was a pulling of the pendulum to a kind of a mixture, obviously full of its shortcomings and hypocrisies. But I would say, and you and I might differ on this, but the drive, for instance, to dismantle formal empires was a very important feature of the story, and that we could never get to the industrialization of Asia. We could never, if you look back at the graph of the soaring curve after 1945, you could not have got that without decolonization. And so I would say that's one example of a way in which the spread of national determination, third world imaginaries, hopes for an alternative. We look back and people tend to be very critical of it. But that was an experiment in trying to create a more distributed system, which really took off after the 1970s, actually, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in some senses, the pendulum stays in the middle, or even in some cases, one might, depending on the location and the time, it swings further to the left, of course, full of its shortcomings and its hypocrisies. So I think there was a very long period that led to these kinds of institutions that are now exhausted and under-resourced and maligned. And I could go on. So I do think those were there, but it's important to recognize them as kind of compromise hybrid systems that were designed to prevent extreme forms of predatory activity.
Yeah, that's very clarifying. And of course, the Toronto School of Communications, for which the college is known, promoted a more multi-directional, exchange-based form of communications that would be more inclusive. So, okay, so my instructions are to encourage the audience to raise their hands and ask questions, but please wait for a microphone to arrive at you. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I see the gentleman here, so. And I'm mindful of time, so would it be okay if I collected 2 questions? Sure. And then we can do a second round? So after this gentleman here, I saw another hand over here. I think there's a second mic. Shayla, so could this gentleman have a microphone? So then after he asks his question, and then you can ask your question, and then Jeremy can answer both together, just because I want to make sure that if anyone else would like to ask, they can. Okay, great. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adelman, for your wonderful lecture. It's a wide-ranging lecture. And you begun with, and thank you, Professor Ewing. It's a pleasure to see you. And you began with Davos and the Carney speech and the idea of the rupture. And of course, you also brought to attention the massive elephant in the room. And I would posit that in the answer to Carney's speech that President Donald Trump gave at Davos, he expressed exactly your sentiment, your model of an altruistic or nativist interdependence, except he placed the U.S. at the side of the altruistic, and relayed an anecdote about talking to the French president about controlling pharmaceutical prices, and expressed, in his words, how Europeans have been free riding and screwing us for the last 30 years. Yeah, he was extremely passionate about it.
Very good imitation.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's praise, sir. And so, could you comment on that and comment on the construction of of America taking its rebalancing the books, sir,
Right.
and America acting as a force for good in the world, but not to be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
And let's have the other question, please. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thank you again. Wonderful talk, and thank you for moderating as well. You know, I'm convinced by a lot of the arguments that you post and the frameworks, but one of the things that left me sort of thinking, especially about the images, is the idea that there's almost an embedded logic within Smith that if you could elicit sympathy, that would elicit political action.
Right.
And I'm not so sure that what we're seeing is that. I'm not so sure that, I mean, in Sontag's articulation, that's a different way. But like, let's say if we revisit Sontag today, the problem isn't so much that we're running out of, say, there's like a sympathy fatigue. It's more that, well, yeah, I could see 170 girls get turned into vapor. What am I supposed to do about it? Or like that's sort of the thought process of the strangers, right? And so this brings me to the sort of final call to action and something interesting that you just mentioned, that you saw sort of the collapse of the socialist bloc in the 90s as a sort of swinging, let's say, to the left side using that sort of model, which I found interesting because to me that's actually like the hardest swing to the right? Like that is when all these ex-socialist bloc countries were completely open for the most rapacious type of plundering since the 90s. And so taking all of that together, how do you think about political apathy in the sort of moment of sort of swinging between the two sides?
Yeah.
Where does a lack of political organization or sort of seeming inability for people to organize themselves fit within these models? And likewise, as you mentioned, sort of looking historically to new ideas, how do you see the role of left-wing and sort of Marxist interpretations of political radical thought? Do you see this as a sort of call to arms of like following those roads not followed or sort of ended, or are those just sort of bad ideas that need to remain in the past?
Okay, sorry, I should have been taking notes. Well, first on very quickly on the discourse, this is an oversimplification, but I'll throw it out there that very often, let's say the nativist posture will be one of the self-sacrificial party that's been exploited and unrecognized and unappreciated. That's textbook stuff out of Psychology 101. So I'm not surprised that the ressentiment, the aggrieved bullshit narrative, that Americans. But what I would say is it kind of has to be understood where it comes from and its affective purpose. But that's in the zero-sum world, of course it's going to be framed in this way. And all we're doing is we're restoring balance, right? And there's a kind of a strange aura of bringing justice back to the world in the name of the nation. So that's stock and trade, actually. And that was there. I'm not saying Donald Trump is Hitler, but it's in the logic of Mein Kampf as well, very much so. That Germany was drained at the benefits of others and its rivals, and we're just restoring what's due. We could say more about it, but what's that? Well, and then it's woven in with all the racial ideology and which has now obviously also come back in a different variant with great replacement theories and so on. Okay, there was a bundle of questions there.
Is the left still relevant?
What's that?
Is the left the communist Marxist?
Well, I think that's probably your punch question, right? Is what about the left?
Political organization.
Yeah.
Like political apathy, the Marxist ideas.
Yeah.
Sort of,
Right.
the left as a project.
Right. So I do think that it's especially challenging. So the assumption that you raised that if you had more sympathy, that would translate into more action, is clearly in some senses broken. That people can have empathy fatigue and lots of empathy at the same time. The fatigue is the sense of being inhibited from or prevented from being able to do anything. This is why, just to come to the end of the talk, I'm very concerned about the effect of doomsday scenarios, because there is no alternative, right? The prophecies are all of gloom. No matter what you do, it's pointless. It's like, if the end is inevitable, why do anything? And that was part of the problem of the immobilization for many sectors, as we're seeing in the 1930s. And it's a little bit the problem the left got. We're going to get into exhuming histories of the left. A little bit the problem that the left got into in the 1970s, frankly. As someone who spent a lot of time with Leo Panitch in this room back in those days, some of the debate. So when you don't have a sense of a future, it's very hard to project an alternative to the present, right? And that's a bit the struggle that the left is having, and why it's very hard to build the kinds of solidarities that I think you're thinking about that would be built out of an attachment of interdependence are very hard to construct. So the left has its work cut out for it. I mean, I could go on, but.
Well, we've actually arrived at the hour, so
Okay.
I want to make sure we have enough time for Emmanuel to speak as well. So would you all just join me in thanking Professor Adelman tonight?
You might wonder why I was doing that pratfall to the podium. My right leg went to sleep, which is no reflection on either Jeremy's talk or the questions that were asked. I just attribute it to my crossing my legs too long. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I want to, as we always do with the alumni lecture, we close with comments from a student. And I'm happy to say that tonight's student speaker is Emmanuel Leotakis. Emmanuel is a third-year student. He's been very active at the college since the first year he got here. He is now, presently he's a Don, but before that he was very active in the Innis Residence Council. And he's also a major in both financial economics and urban studies, which roots him back to both some of what the talk was about in terms of Harold Innis, but also at the core of what Innis was often about as a college. So, Emmanuel.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Adelman for this very insightful presentation and with such an effective storytelling style along with it. And thank you also to Professor Ewing for moderating such an engaging Q&A session. And I would also like to thank you all for so eagerly and enthusiastically participating in tonight's conversation on a topic that couldn't be any more relevant today. And I won't take much more of your time tonight, but I would like to start by saying how fitting I found that first example you used to describe that tension between the dynamism and also the reaction in interdependence. As a person who lived in Greece, as I'm Greek myself, and also as a student in economics that has seen that GDP graph many times before, I found it very well presented, this two-way street between how we can achieve both increase in welfare, but also see those reactions around the world. And I also find it quite fascinating, how throughout my previous education, both as a student here and in high school before, how often I have come across the discussion around globalization that seemed to be such a big phenomenon over the past decade and such a decisive moment for the 21st century, and how interesting it is today to see how the conversations have already shifted, maybe away from globalization and closer to a conversation around the interdependent state of the world currently, where we stand. And how the ever-changing the world can be, even today we see with all the geopolitical events, and how history can be a key to understanding all of the present situations, as was also talked about during the Q&A. And in face of uncertainty, all we have is this reliance on strangers, this reliance and dependence that still affects a lot of the aspects of our everyday life and everyday activities in many different domains. And listening to this presentation, I couldn't help but think of the final line in A Streetcar Named Desire, a play by Tennessee Williams, where the protagonist Blanche states that I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. And in our scenario, this statement does sound true, not because of our inability to perceive the reality for what it is, but rather for our awareness of how interconnected our societies have become, and how much we do depend on the kindness of people across the globe when it comes to the supply chains or the spread of ideas and knowledge. And it is at key institutions such as universities, like we are here tonight, engaging in those kind of conversations, that these ideas can continue to spread and we can continue to develop and discuss on how to craft solutions for a better modern world. And lastly, to conclude, I did find the comments on the empathetic fatigue very relevant, especially with the rise of social media today, whether it be Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and many, many more that keep appearing every day. There's so many new information coming in, and the comment on that sometimes the images themselves can be the war in itself, I think couldn't be any more relevant, given how AI is also starting to influence our perspective on those topics. So tonight, I have been raised to believe that the multiculturality of our communities constitutes one of our greatest strengths, and that despite the doomsday prophecies, some optimism and hope can pierce through, and that the rough patch, as was said, is not the end in itself, but an opportunity to find new ways forward, and hopefully tonight this was one path in that direction that I hope to see continuing. Thank you.